In one of the best scenes of the series, Varys sits down with Tyrion Lannister to tell him a riddle.
3 great men sit in a room, a king, a priest, and a rich man. Between them stands a common sellsword. Each great man bids the sellsword kill the other 2. Who lives, who dies?
The riddle questions who lives and who dies between 4 men. A priest, a king, a rich noble, and a sellsword. The sellsword has the tools to administer death to everyone there, but ultimately, who has the best chance of survival by ultimately wooing his favor? Is it the king who possesses bureaucratic power, who can raise his station and offer him land and title? Is it the rich noble whose vast wealth can give him the gold to satiate whatever his desires may be? Or is it the priest who carries favor with the supernatural and can offer the benefits and blessings of a higher authority? It is a question of power and who ultimately wields it. The theme of what defines power is explored throughout the entire book series of A Song of Ice and Fire, and throughout all 7 seasons of the TV series. So join me as we explore what power means in the world of Game of Thrones, and ultimately, who is the one that wields it. So if there's one thing that is explored again and again throughout the series, it is the nature of power and what it takes to rule. Series creator George R.R. Martin seeks to explore the nature of rule, rather than providing the stock answers seen in typical fantasy and myth-based stories where wise kings rule justly and well, without getting into the nitty-gritty details of what defines rule.
Books is to reflect the difficulty of rule, because it is very difficult. It's hard, and you don't see that in a lot of fantasy. I don't know if you've read a lot of fantasy or not, but you know, you look at Tolkien, and at the end of the books, Sauron has been defeated, Aragorn is king, and Tolkien just says, and he ruled wisely and well for 500 years or whatever. And it's easy to type, you know, he ruled wisely and well. But then you start asking yourself, what does that constitute, ruling wisely and well? I mean, what was his tax policy? How did the economy function, under him? Did he encourage trade? Did he discourage it? What about the class system? You know, the rising peasantry and the burgeoning middle class. Was those encouraged or put down? Did he give power to the aristocracy? The orcs. There are still tens, thousands of orcs left over at the end of Lord of the Rings. Did he pursue a policy of genocide toward them?
Throughout all the ancillary materials and in the text itself, as well as the expanded material about the history of Westeros, there have been hundreds of pages dedicated towards detailing the history of the numerous Targaryen kings, each giving examples of different kinds of rulers, like Maegor the Cruel, who became infamous for his rampant butchery and cruelty with his war against the Faith of the Seven and the suppression of their military arm of the Faith Militant. This, along with other infamous acts like murdering every builder who constructed his infamous Red Keep, made him the perfect example of a tyrant who controlled by using fear. But Maegor's cruelty led him to a point where he ultimately killed himself using the barbed thrones of the Iron Throne itself as he slit his veins upon it, rather than face the retribution of the 7 kingdoms that had turned against him, and his effort to rule it with an iron fist. Then there are kings like Aegon the Unworthy, a king who was loathed by most of the kingdom and did little to govern besides feed his gluttonous appetite for food, women, and other vices. A man who single-handedly started the Blackfire Rebellion when he legitimized all of his bastard children on his deathbed. Throughout the hundreds of years of fictional history, there are examples of the delicate relationship between people in positions of power, and how that power can prove to be very fleeting. But if there is one central idea that unifies the thousands of years of fictional history, it is what is the nature of power itself. Does it come in the form of kings who are given sovereignty to rule over all? Is it through men of the cloth who claim divine favor with the gods whom control all of creation? Or is it simply the lords of the land who accumulate so much wealth who truly rule over all, seeing how much they can bestow upon the common man in order to raise their station with land and title? Throughout the history of Westeros and in the series itself, this riddle is explored as we see the nature of power from all 3 vantage points. Of course, the classical example of power is through sheer force, as represented by Aegon the Conqueror. He possessed the last 3 remaining dragons in the world, seeing how all of the others had gone extinct during the doom of Valyria. But his technological superiority of winged serpents who could breathe molten death was able to conquer 6 of the 7 kingdoms and bring them under his rule and establish his monarchy and dynasty that would last for 300 years. That was a power created by sheer brute force, but even the power of dragons had its limits. Aegon the Conqueror was able to subdue 6 of the 7 kingdoms, but Dorne resisted. Unlike the other kingdoms, the Dornish people did not give him the benefit of fighting out in an open field, whereas dragons could incinerate their armies. Instead, they would flee from their strongholds and cities, committing ambushes and raids, then slipping away into the desert or mountain passes, where even the fires of Balerion the Black Dread, the biggest dragon that ever existed, would prove useless. This insurrection cost Aegon the lives of his beloved sister and queen Rhaenys, as well as the dragon Meraxus, who was struck down with a bolt through the eye, forcing Aegon to end his conquest 1 kingdom short. Sheer brute force is certainly one way to claim power, but even that can have its limits, where even the fire of dragons cannot subdue the shifting sands of insurrection. But it was that power that allowed the Targaryens to build a dynasty and force an entire continent to accept the rule of a foreign invader. As generations continued, even when the power of dragons fell away, when most of them were killed during the Dance of Dragons, which was the great Targaryen civil war where most of their dragons died out, but they were still able to hold on to that power because their lineage had become entrenched into the culture of Westeros for over a century. The divine right to rule that they took through fire of dragons became their divine right with the passage of time. But even this power would begin to fade as years of inbreeding would lead to Targaryen kings prone to madness like the Mad King Aerys, who was ultimately overthrown by Robert Baratheon in his own show of force and rebellion. Because what is a king if he does not have lords who follow his rule? This brings us to the second point on the triangle of power, the rich man. Throughout the books and the show, there is no better representation of power than Tywin Lannister, the Lion of Casterly Rock. His family is famed for their gold mines, making them one of the most influential houses in all of Westeros. Tywin has always been at the center of power, from the time he served as Hand of the King to Aerys, where his influence grew so great that people began to whisper that it was he who truly ruled the country and not Aerys. And it was his wealth and power that put him in a position to ultimately overthrow Aerys and help install the new king, Robert Baratheon, and secure an alliance by marrying off his daughter to have her become Robert's queen. But his true rise of power came when Robert Baratheon ultimately met his end while hunting a boar. One could argue it was Cersei who orchestrated his death by having his squire serve him too much wine, but it was Robert's gluttony that ultimately did him in, and from here Tywin drew his ultimate power to rule. While Joffrey was a figurehead who merely abused his station to torment anyone he pleased, Tywin used his influence and capital to assume authority of the Seven Kingdoms, effectively ruling it during the War of the Five Kings, using his station to serve as the true king without a throne. And in several scenes we see Tywin assert his authority over Joffrey's insolence.
I haven't been counseled.
You are being counseled at this very moment. The king is tired. See him to his chambers.
Come along.
I'm not tired.
We have so much to celebrate.
I'm not tired!
Grand Maester, perhaps some essence of nightshade to help him sleep.
So is it not really kings who have power, but rather the rich men who support them? Are they the true rulers over everyone, and the real winners of the Game of Thrones? Not entirely, because what is higher than a king but a god? Now, it's difficult to debate the validity of gods in the world of Game of Thrones, seeing how it's magic light world and the only one that has ever manifested its power in any tangible way is the Lord of Light through use of the dark shadow assassin that killed Renly Baratheon, as well as the resurrection of Jon Snow and Beric Dondarrion. But what's important rather than the validation of proof of the supernatural is that most of the characters in the world of Westeros have some belief in it. It is real to them, and provides a method for those who do not have power to gain it. This is best exemplified by the rise of the High Sparrow. He is a figure similar to Jesus or Buddha, where he was born into a rich family of cobblers and enjoyed the excess that his skill and station brought him, until one night he felt so ashamed of it that he left it all behind to become a wandering septon, ministering to the poor and downtrodden. But his acts of kindness to those who were trampled by the kings and nobles of Westeros gave him another form of power, the power of respect of the common people. It was through his iron will and conviction in the tenets of his faith that turned him into a leader, someone with great influence, the literal Bernie Sanders of Westeros. Cersei made the mistake of thinking that the influence could ultimately be another tool to serve her own ends, and sought to have him named as the High Septon and reinstated the Faith Militant, an order which had been banned for centuries, thinking it would only serve her needs of ridding herself of Margaery Tyrell. But she made the mistake of giving the High Sparrow even more political and military power, being able to go after those he deemed as religious transgressors. But This power turned against her once she came to the terrible realization that the same steely will that had given him popularity and influence over the common folk meant that they could not be bribed to serve her interests. He was a monster of her own making, whom she ultimately was powerless against, as the forces of his Inquisition came to challenge her station. His belief had come to manifest in the real world, giving him actionable political power. Even if the Seven do not exist, because of his belief and conviction of his belief, he was given power and station by the people who trusted in him. But that's the thing, as Varys so eloquently puts,
Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall.
power is merely an illusion. It holds no sway in the natural world. The edgy atheists among you can laugh at those who claim to wield the power of God or Jesus as just superstitious fairy tales, but the idea of political power and the power of finance are just as fake. They are merely mutually agreed upon, artificially created social constructs that do not exist in the natural world. You can go out into the woods with a crown and say that this land is yours because you are king, but that doesn't make it yours. Someone can take it from you, or maybe it'll be reclaimed once you feel the sweet embrace of death. You can throw money at it and say it's yours because you have enough paper, but do you truly have dominion over it? Can you take it away from the beasts of the forest or the forces of time that will scour your influence and ultimately take it back? These are systems that we have created to evolve our social structure for higher benefits, but they are ultimately fictitious, abstract things as imaginary as the gods that edgy Reddit atheists love to mock. Power is ultimately an illusion. It lies wherever people believe it does, and if anything, the series of Game of Thrones, outside of all the backstabbing and betrayal, beyond all the Dungeons and Dragons, is an exploration about the nature of power. We saw the War of Five Kings, in which 5 men all believed they had the power and deserved to rule, but ultimately none of them survived as they all struggled to wrestle control over the abstract idea of power. But like the shadow on the wall, it was something none of them could put their hands around. Renly thought he had power until his brother took it away from him with a sword. Stannis thought that by all the laws of man, that power should have been his, considering the fact that none of Robert's children were actually fathered by him, but ultimately he was one who nobody could ever truly love, and by the end of his reign he was cut down. Balon Greyjoy sought power through force by declaring himself king and raiding the coast of Westeros, but was ultimately overthrown by his mad brother Euron. Robb Stark thought that the love of the people and being on the just side of history would lead him to being able to maintain power, but several poor strategic decisions cost him most of his bannermen and allies. Joffrey believed that power was his God-given birthright to do whatever he pleased to whomever he pleased, thinking that there could never be any consequence for his actions, but then learned that a kingdom ruled by cruelty would inspire a cruel death that he would be forced to face alone. 5 kings seeking power, 5 corpses that lost it. Throughout Season 2, when Tyrion was made Hand of the King and managed the King's Landing, he was one of the most powerful men in Westeros, and when his father returned, all of that power was stripped away from him in an instant. Ultimately, power is something that exists where people believe it does, and the Game of Thrones series and A Song of Ice and Fire books have been a prolonged examination of the slippery and abstract nature of power. Who can hold it, who can wield it, and ultimately how easily they can lose it. Beyond the dragons and the blood magic, the greatest magical power in Game of Thrones is the nature of power, and in the final season, we'll get to see who finally is left behind to claim the Iron Throne after everything is said and done. Which woman will it be, Daenerys or Cersei, 2 women who have claimed their positions through fire and blood? Or might it possibly be another? But that is the slippery nature of the beast, and one of the core themes of Game of Thrones, a riddle that we've spent the past 9 years mulling over. So what do you think about the nature of power in Game of Thrones? Does it exist, or is it merely an illusion, or does it not matter if you're riding a fire-breathing dragon? Tune in next Sunday for another Game of Thrones video before you watch the newest episode premiere, and let me know what you think of the nature of power in the comments below. That's it for this week. Tune in next Sunday before the new episode of Game of Thrones premieres to check out a new Game of Thrones video essay by yours truly, Sir Lobster of Magnet. Before I bid you adieu, I have a special tale I'd like to tell. This is a story about the game of content creation where hundreds of thousands of creators compete in a never-ending tournament to make content for you, the people of the internet. But it is a dark time. The kingdom of Patreon has banned Lord Sargon of House Akkad from their lands, and in the far-off exotic land of the EU, they've passed a new charter, Article 13, which casts a dark shadow upon the intrepid content creator knights, both big and small, seeking to make their living doing this work. In this time of peril and demonetization, who will stand with the creators? What? Who's that? It's Bounty, the new crowdfunding platform of the people for the people. Now I ask you, who is watching this video, will you join me in pledging your banners towards House Bounty? Will anyone else stand up to these tech tyrants?
You have my sword, Sir Lobster of Magnet.
Is this Sir Wings of House Prophecy has pledged his sword to my cause? And Wings of Prophecy has placed a bounty asking for a video discussing Game of Thrones and Berserk. For you see, that's how bounty works. You can make a bounty for me to complete asking for something you want to see, or you can pledge to a current project that I've made and be featured in the video. So if you want to fight this revolution, check out my bounty page for future videos I will be making for a month of Ice and Fire, and pledge your support for the ones you like and become the vanguard of a new revolution. Link in the description below. And before we leave, a thank you to Tim and the Bald Sexy for filming the short live-action interlude scene in this video. Support them by checking out their channel and giving them a sub, link in the description below, and they even put out their first video talking about how awful job interviews are, so go and give that a watch. And remember, lobster's antennas, but don't you grab it.